So, as I say, Australia 108 is the tallest residential tower in the Southern Hemisphere. And greetings, Craig. I can see you there. Fantastic. We can hear a little bit about the client journey and the design process of the building, some of the challenges they had to go through, and some of the lessons learned. Craig's a highly credentialed and experienced contemporary architect with an inception to completion approach. And his project work includes the delivery of the entire new Acton precinct over a 10-year period. And currently, as I say, he's working on the super tall Australia 108. Craig, can you hear me? I believe you might be muted there. Is your... there we go.
First trick of the pen.
Fantastic.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
And
you can hear me okay?
Today, Craig?
Yes, I am in Melbourne today. I'm joining from our studio in Melbourne at the moment.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'll hand it over to you. Tell us about the building.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Craig Baudin, as I was introduced. Thanks, Timothy. I'm going to talk a bit about Australia 108, which is a 320-metre super tall residential building, which we recently completed in Melbourne. For those people who live in Melbourne and may have seen it starting to creep above the skyline over the last few years. It was recently completed. And what I'm going to touch on, 20 minutes is not a lot of time for a big project like this, but I'm going to try and touch on, I suppose, how did the project come about? What was our design thinking? Yeah, what were some of the challenges? And I suppose, what do buildings like this mean in the current new reality that we face at the moment? So I'm just going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Can you see that?
Yes, that's good. Thanks, Craig.
Great. So I think, firstly and foremost, I think Australia 108 is really it is affirmatively about cities and what density can do to revitalize and enliven cities in many ways. And what's been really interesting is having this building completed in a year that has really seen, in some ways, a crisis of confidence in cities themselves. I kind of started this whole kind of thinking around this presentation around this tweet from Andrew Cuomo, who's the governor of New York. This was from March 23rd, so really just the beginning of the pandemic, where he said, "This is not life as usual. There is a density level in New York City that's destructive. It has to stop, and it has to stop now. New York City must develop an immediate plan to reduce density." Now, whether he still feels that way or not, it really sums up this crisis of confidence in cities and urbanism. It's kind of shaken our views on urbanism to the core in some ways. And there's been a lot of thinking, is this a critical deflection point in what cities mean as we know it, and ultimately what the skyscraper means as we know it? So I'm sort of taking the view that, I think cities are perhaps more resilient than we give them credit for. Cities have always been at the heart of innovation and progress. And I think they have the resilience to survive this moment in history. Australia 108 is a project that celebrates, in a way, what density can do for cities. This is an image that we like to show, which kind of gives a sense of really what we're talking about when we talk about density in the urban and suburban Australian context. Here in red is the footprint of Australia 108, which has a site footprint of just 3/4 of an acre. And here it is overlaid on an outer eastern suburban landscape of Melbourne to scale. And you can see it occupies what would normally be taken up by 3 suburban houses. If we were to just zoom out a bit, that yellow dotted outline is, if we were to house the occupants of that building in this context, that's the amount of land and water and resources needed to house these people. And that comes at a cost. It comes at an environmental cost, a social cost, a public transport cost, an infrastructure cost. So what is Australia 108? It is a 100-level residential super tall building. It has 1,100 apartments and a potential population of around 2,500, which is equivalent to a small country town. And in some ways, these buildings are becoming like vertical communities, equivalent to a town in their own right. And so some of the thinking around what does that mean for how you design these buildings and what they have to offer the people who live in them. So I think there is a place in the city for a multitude of development scales, from the super tall to the more modest scale projects. I mean, high-rise development needs to be strategic where it can be, and look at where we can support and strengthen infrastructure. Melbourne, for example, is not a traditional European city that has a uniform high density of 8 to 9 stories throughout its core. It's effectively a high-rise core with a very low-rise periphery. And to try to redefine what it means to bring people into that city and bring in density, it's not going to work if it's done on a building by building basis. It's going to take too many generations to do that. So it needs to be strategic in trying to leverage opportunities for density and population where we can. And Melbourne's done that, whether it's by plan or design, or it's had an acceleration of population over the last 10 years. And what's driving that is really what drives people to cities. I mean, the residents of this building have a walkable lifestyle. They're close to employment, they're close to entertainment, they're close to arts and parks, they're close to the bay, the cultural facilities. All of these things are what makes cities great and makes people want to live in cities like this. So in terms of the project genesis, how did it come about? I think, like all really large projects, it really needs a client that's engaged with the process and has a really strong vision of what they want, and the ability to see that through. So our client was a Singaporean property developer called World Class Land. They are a business that had their origins in the jewelry business before branching out to property, and their property business eventually became their biggest asset and their biggest part of their business. They wanted their first foray into Australia to be a landmark project and perhaps bring a sense of the kind of amenity-focused development that is more common in residential communities in Singapore, which has a more dense approach to living. And this was only really just starting to find favour in Australia and in Melbourne in particular. If you look over the Eureka Tower, which we designed for Melbourne maybe 15 years ago, has a very comparatively lesser degree of amenity. It was just a different culture, this idea of creating almost like a community in a building with all this amenity. It's a different approach to residential design. So in many ways, this project has set a new benchmark for what kind of residential facilities amenities can enjoy. I mean, we're providing 4,500 square meters of residence facilities in this project over 3 levels. So in terms of the evolution of the design, it was always, the site has been within our office perhaps for over 10 or 12 years, and it's gone through a number of evolutions and different clients and different ownerships. It was always seen as a site that could accommodate density and height, mainly because South Bank is one of the densest suburbs in Australia now, and also because south of the river, the shadowing and amenity impacts on the rest of the city are minimised. So it was finally purchased 7 years ago by World Class Land, and we started that journey with them as to what this building could be. And I've got on the screen a series of text messages. This is our client, Koei Seng. And I think in terms of design process, for me, it's really interesting about this kind of having a client that's super engaged. We would receive text messages from all hours of the day and night, sketches of core thoughts, ideas about how refuse shoots could work, from the smallest detail to the biggest detail. And that's what any architect really wants, is a client who's really got the sense of engagement with the detail and has a passion for the project, and that you're not designing in a vacuum. And you're not designing perhaps something that's really just an abstract financial exercise. It is a real, genuine design collaboration. So how did the design evolve? I suppose I tend to put this sketch up first. In a way, this is in some ways the genesis of the design. This is an early sketch from Nonda Katsalidis, one of our founding partners. And Nonda had this idea at the very beginning of a building that perhaps broke away from the stereotypical skyscraper mold, that perhaps wasn't just a slender tower that got more and more slender. Perhaps it was something that had this exclamation mark in the sky, this piece of jewelry, if you like, that sits in the sky and kind of above in the skyline, and it can be read in different ways from different parts of the city and becomes almost like a marker. That was the origins of the Starburst. And originally the concept was this could be a sky lobby for a hotel, but it kind of, with the new client that we had and their focus on residents' facilities and amenities, it became really apparent that we needed more space. We couldn't actually accommodate in our footprint all the facilities we wanted to. And having this explosion at the 2/3 point of the building, this eruption where we get this exclamation that comes out, we actually managed to almost double the footprint of the building, and we can accommodate so much more. And then the building around that then evolved as a kind of in many ways as a counterpoint in response to that Starburst element, as a series of different approaches. We started off with rectilinear geometries, we started off with curvilinear geometries, and in the end the building evolved into this kind of hybrid of the curvilinear and the rectilinear. And this is an image of the scheme as completed. And it kind of has a slightly interesting aspect from different viewpoints. It really kind of shifts and it kind of confounds your thinking about what the form truly is. And the Starburst itself then becomes this kind of marker that you can see from everywhere in the city, really. You always find yourself surprised when you see it through a glimpse of two other buildings or from a vista that you'd never anticipated. One of the other considerations was not just purely on the aesthetics of this, but really these tall buildings are really engineering. They have to be approached from an engineering perspective. So we knew that lateral stability and wind would be one of the biggest structural drivers of this design and how it could work. And so we really started thinking about how we derive this from a wind tunnel / wind performance perspective. And some of these forms are really about diverting and baffling and diverting and distracting the wind in a sense, so that we don't present a building that can kind of move with the wind and be and can be designed to be in a way working with the engineers to drive a better wind result and a better structural engineering result. And one of the other aspects of it is this really, in a way, kind of unusual situation where we have this partnership with Eureka Tower. It's not very common that a practice gets to design two buildings of 300 meters, within a very short distance of each other. And it was this really interesting opportunity that they could sort of bounce off each other and talk to each other. And so some of those motifs and materiality are echoed in Australia 108, and they become these kind of partners in the skyline. And we also thought the idea of these scale markers that we have, these banded spandrels that move up the building, that maybe there was an opportunity to do something a little bit different with this building to Eureka Tower, especially in the way the building is perceived at night. And we looked at this approach where we could perhaps backlight the facade spandrels, the horizontal spandrels at the slabs. And we did a whole bunch of prototyping with different panels to kind of get just the right amount of brightness and the subtlety that we needed to get this without being overtly lighting the building up, but a kind of really subtle kind of three-dimensionality to it. And these are some of the prototypes that we did. But the idea behind it was this kind of really interesting idea of this wireframe in the sky at night, this kind of a series of these hoops that subtly reflect the form of the building. And then as you move around the city at night and from different angles, you get this really differing perspective and perception of how the building works and how the form works, with the Starburst as this kind of glowing series of jewelry within that wireframe. And even at dusk and dawn, you get this really kind of interesting enhancement of a subtle, of a subtle glow in the building. So I mentioned this idea about these buildings being vertical communities, and I think that is very apt for this project. Not everyone can. This is one of the penthouse upper level 97 or 98. Not everyone can live up at this level and afford to live up at this level. We're actually looking down on Eureka Tower, which you can see just beyond there, behind that white couch. Some people are living on level 12, but they all want to feel like they're part of this really amazing building. They can share in these views and these outlooks. And so the building is divided into 3 rises, which is a fairly standard tall building kind of approach. But we've got these amenities at the Starburst at level 70 and amenities at level 11. And what these amenities, and as well as that, it kind of gives us this ability to have a whole bunch of different configurations of footprints within size. We could go from 18 apartments to plate to 8 to 4 to 2 to 1. So there's a variety of different sizes of apartment and what apartment offering. And that's part of that whole getting this diverse community of people, from people who are couples to singles to large families. And all of it really centered around this idea of the starburst at level 70 being this almost like a town hall or a communal heart for the building where everyone can come together and enjoy the view, even if they only live on level 12. This is a plan of the starburst. It's we've got two, at this level, there's two lap pools, one facing the city and one facing the bay, and then a number of other facilities like lounges, dining facilities, private dining, even some garden spaces. This is one of the pool spaces. This is one from some of the early renderings. And we have gyms, all the usual kind of facilities, but there's the quantum and the amount of these spaces are amped up over what you would expect in a normal building just because of the population that we have. And slightly unusual spaces that you wouldn't expect in a building like this. This is at level 70. This is what we've called the Sky Garden. This is a naturally ventilated with motor, sort of winter garden space that can shut down when the winds get too significant. But it's a very gentle kind of retreat space that allows you to sit within landscape, but looking out over the city and kind of get a sense of the natural world outside by the fresh air that comes through it. And then the usual sort of dining and other communal spaces that you have in these kinds of projects. And at level 11, we have a 25-meter lap pool and some other significant gym and other facilities. So one of the things that we did want to do differently with this project was to really think carefully about how we hit the ground. A lot of tall buildings do hit the ground in quite an aggressive way, and we wanted to have a very gentle, human-scaled interaction with the street. And so we had a constraint that our car park, because of soil conditions, couldn't be subterranean. So we had this idea of shrouding the entire podium car park, which was above ground, with this green shroud, effectively, of dense planting. And so we looked at this cantilevering out large-scale planter boxes with 3-meter diameter sort of canary palms and other significant planting, and this planting has really started to take off and really getting established, even only 6 months after completion. And it's this really interesting layering of cantilevered elements interwoven with the denser planting spaces. And this is the section of how that car park works. It's a kind of really interesting and three-dimensional facade when you're in this space. And when you're actually parking your car, it creates this kind of really almost ethereal and quite spiritual experience that you don't normally associate with a car park. You've got this sort of layer of green around you with the light filtering in, and it's a really beautiful space. Like any tall building, though, we had some significant challenges. I won't go through all of them, but I thought one that was worth discussing in the time that we had was the starburst, which is probably the most tricky element that we had to face. And it was a real engineering challenge for the entire team. As you can see, it's a significant cantilever from the building face, up to 6 or 7 meters in places. And from the contractor's point of view and from the design team's point of view is how do we design something like this that can be erected 200 meters in the sky? It's actually projecting over an arterial road in places. How do we get that to work from a logistics and safety point of view? And something that works to program as well, that doesn't completely make the building grind to a halt on site. So here is just a bit of an axonometric of that space. You can see the core is quite small, and you can see how far it has to cantilever out from that core element. To add to the complexity, this is also one of the stability floors, so it has significant belt truss elements below it that help stabilize the building. So, and then to add even further insult to injury, we put infinity edge lap pools right at the tip of the cantilever at each end, which adds further dead weight to this element. And these are some of the views from those pools as they've been built. So, and then on top of that, we've got a building that effectively sways 600 millimeters off center line, as all tall buildings do. And this building has a sway of 600 mil off center line. We're conscious that when you get certain harmonic motions setting up in pools, and particularly on windy days, that you can get quite significant sloshing and wave events in these pools. So there's a lot of thought around having an oversized balance tank with a wind sensor that could allow the pool to drain half its volume in those kind of situations so that we don't end up with a watery mess everywhere. And then to actually build this element, to build the starburst, we really decided that prefabrication was the only way it was going to happen. So here's some of the prototype facade panels that were fabricated in China. All the curtain wall elements were prefabricated in China, and some of the trickier corners. They were then shipped to Melbourne, and in Tullamarine, all of the structural steel work was fabricated and put together. And then these were large 3-story trusses that ran the whole length of each side of the starburst. They were then clad in the factory and driven to site on a truck. And then we had to, usually the dead of morning, like 4 o'clock in the morning when they could shut the roads down. And then these get hoisted 200 meters into the air and bolted into connection. And that in itself is not the easiest thing to do. These are effectively giant sails catching the wind. They have to be bolted down carefully, and it all has to click together in a very elegant and simple way. That means there's no access required from the outside. And so Multiplex did some amazing work with the construction team and the engineering team, and working with us to really do a digital dress rehearsal of this entire erection sequence. And it was all done in computer as a full animation. And so there's a series of these amazing movies, and these are some of the stills from that animation. And it was really every single person on that site, every activity, every temporary bracket was modeled and checked. And and as they came through problems, they would come back to the design team. We'd look at how do we change this junction or amend this detail so that we can optimize the erection of the starburst. As you can see, the level of detail in these is quite phenomenal. And it was a solid 3 to 4 months of just iterative 3D modeling and BIM coordination work to ensure that all of this stuff connected together correctly on site. And then from our point of view, knowing that, these giant steel members, when they all come together, we've got these beautiful spaces that are uninterrupted and unencumbered by structure, and that live up to the vision of this amazing outlook onto the city. And then the final part of the puzzle was how to complete it and how to stage it. If anyone's worked on really tall buildings, staging and completion and partial handover is a critical part of it. In order to make this thing financially viable, we had 6 handover stages to make the financing of this project ultimately work. And so you end up with these complexities around it. You might have the residents moving in on level 40 as shown here in red, but you've got 4 more stages above you of work that's still happening. And so you need to deal with how are people escaping from the building, how are fire services and engineering working, is the building safe, is it comfortable to enter? And so for that reason, we had staged plant rooms throughout the building to allow this diversity to happen and to ensure that we were always being able to serve up to the components of the building that were being completed. And so we end up with a situation like this, which is in the 3rd quarter of 2019, where you've got the jump forms still jumping, you've got slabs being poured, you've still got some parts of the facade being erected. And then below the starburst, you've got people living effectively for quite a number of years in a building site, and then trying to manage the logistics of all of that. And finally, this is the completed product. So I thought, I'm running out of time and I'm conscious I don't want to go too long. I suppose to conclude, I'd probably want to finish on this point. I think tall buildings of this scale, they're long and complex tasks. But I think they're essential ingredients of what makes our cities vibrant places, amongst a whole bunch of other building typologies that go into make cities these great, interesting places for people to live in. I strongly believe that once this pandemic is over, cities will take their rightful place as the sort of engine rooms of our society when it comes to innovation and thinking and culture. I think watch this space. I think cities aren't done yet. Thank you.